The order came down at 0400, one shot, 940 yards, 40-knot crosswind. Rain so heavy the target disappeared between heartbeats. Colonel Marcus Hale stood behind her with his arms crossed and his voice flat as desert stone. "You've got 60 seconds, Captain. Everyone's watching." He didn't say it to motivate her. He said it because he wanted witnesses. Witnesses to the moment Evelyn Cross finally broke. She'd survived 2 combat deployments, buried friends under foreign skies, and logged more confirmed long-range eliminations than half the men on this base combined. And not one of them believed she belonged here. They were all about to find out how wrong they were. If this story hits you, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Nevada desert doesn't care about your reputation. That was the first thing Evelyn Cross noticed when the transport van rolled through the main gate of Black Ridge Training Base at 5:30 in the morning, kicking up a rooster tail of pale dust behind it. The landscape outside the smeared window was pure indifference. Flat hard pan stretching in every direction, broken up by ridgelines the color of old rust, and a sky the washed-out gray of week-old concrete. No trees, no shade, no mercy. She pressed 2 fingers against the window glass and felt the cold already bleeding through it, even in late April. Nights in the high desert dropped without warning, and mornings followed like hangovers, dry and brutal, and completely without sympathy. There were 11 other candidates in the van. She'd counted them twice without meaning to, the same way she'd always counted things: entrances, exits, sightlines, heads, old habits. The other 11 were all men, ranging from a wiry staff sergeant who looked barely 22 to a thick-necked master sergeant in his late 30s who had the permanent squint of someone who'd spent years behind glass. Nobody talked much. That was fine. Evelyn hadn't come here to talk. She'd come here to qualify. The Army's Long-Range Precision Fire Course, LRPF, or more commonly called the Grind by anyone who'd survived it, was a 12-week evaluation that functioned less like a training program and more like a sustained attempt to convince you to quit. The curriculum combined advanced ballistics theory, fieldcraft, observation techniques, and live-fire qualification under conditions specifically designed to strip away every crutch a shooter might lean on. Wind, rain, darkness, sleep deprivation, social pressure. The course didn't just test whether you could put lead on target. It tested whether you could do it when your hands were shaking and your spotter was dead and some colonel was standing 8 feet behind you with a clipboard and a very particular kind of silence. Evelyn had applied 3 times. The first 2 applications had come back with form rejections that didn't even specify a reason. The third time, a JAG officer she'd never met had apparently flagged the pattern to someone with more stars than Colonel Hale, and the application had gone through in 72 hours. She didn't know the details and hadn't asked. What mattered was that she was in the van. She adjusted the strap of her kit bag and stared at the passing desert. Black Ridge was bigger than it looked from the gate. The main cantonment area spread across 40 acres of flat hardpan, barracks, armory, motor pool, a chow hall that smelled permanently of institutional eggs. But the real facility extended far beyond the fence line. Ranges stretched outward in 3 directions, the farthest ones barely visible as distant berms through the morning haze. She'd read the orientation packet twice on the flight from Fort Bragg. Range 7, the one they used for the final qualification, sat 980 yards from the primary firing position, tucked behind a natural depression that created unpredictable wind shearing across the last 300 yards of the flight path. She'd studied the topographic overlay until the contour lines were printed behind her eyelids. The van stopped outside a long, low building with a corrugated metal roof and a wooden sign that read, "In processing" in black block letters. Someone had written "Abandon Hope" in smaller letters beneath it with a marker. The joke was probably funnier to people who weren't already thinking about Range 7. They filed out in no particular order. A sergeant first class with a clipboard and the dead-eyed efficiency of someone who'd processed 100 of these classes took their names, issued bunk assignments, and pointed them toward the armory for weapon sign-out without once changing his expression. The armory issued each candidate a chassis rifle, an M201, enhanced sniper rifle in .300 Win Mag, suppressor optional, scope 0 to 200 yards and left for each candidate to re-zero from there. The rifles smelled like fresh oil in storage. Evelyn ran her hands over the action the way her grandfather had taught her. Slow, deliberate, checking the bolt face and the chamber and the crown of the barrel before she looked at anything else. The armorer, a young specialist with ink-stained fingers, watched her do it. "Most guys just grab it and go," he said. "Good for most guys," she said, and handed him back the bolt for a visual inspection of the firing pin channel. He blinked. Then he actually looked at the firing pin channel himself, found a thin crust of old carbon around the striker, and replaced the bolt assembly without being asked. He handed it back without comment. She thanked him and moved on. Colonel Marcus Hale introduced himself at 700 sharp, standing at the front of a classroom, with his hands clasped behind his back, and the particular stillness of a man who was used to rooms going quiet when he entered them. He was 51 years old, 6'1", and built like someone who'd kept lifting long after his peers had switched to golf. His service record was legitimate: 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Silver Star from a firefight outside Kandahar that had ended badly for everyone except his squad, and a decade of instruction and evaluation experience that had produced a long list of qualified precision shooters. He was good at his job. He was also, as Evelyn had been warned by 2 separate people before she'd ever set foot on this base, a man who operated on a very specific theory about who belonged in elite training programs, and who was there for reasons that had more to do with optics than with merit. He looked at all 12 candidates for a long moment. His gaze moved down the row with flat professional assessment, until it reached her. Then it paused. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But she'd been watching for it. "Welcome to Black Ridge," he said. "You are not here because anyone thinks you can do this. You are here because you think you can. There is a meaningful difference. My job is to find out which of you is wrong." He let that sit for a moment. "This course has a 43% completion rate. That number is not a failure of the program. It is the program working correctly. If everyone graduated, it wouldn't mean anything." He walked slowly along the front of the room. "I don't care where you came from. I don't care what your record says. I don't care about prior qualifications, letters of recommendation, or whatever story you've been telling yourself on the flight out here. What I care about is what you can do under conditions that are designed to make performance impossible. That is the only currency that matters on this installation." His gaze came back to Evelyn one more time. "Any questions?" Silence. "Good," he said. "PT at 0530 every morning. Range work starts at 0800. You eat when I say you eat. You sleep 4 to 6 hours, and you will learn to be functional on that. If you have a problem with any of this, there is a form on my desk. You fill it out, you turn it in, and you're on a transport back to wherever you came from by afternoon. No shame, no record, just clarity." He picked up his cover from the desk and put it on. "See you on the range." So, the first week was mostly assessment. They ran candidates through a standardized battery, physical fitness evaluation, basic marksmanship at distances from 200 to 600 yards, field observation exercises, radio communication protocol tests, and a land navigation course that covered 11 kilometers of broken terrain in full kit. The nav course was timed, and time penalties compounded. 2 candidates finished outside the cutoff on day 3 and were on a transport by evening. Evelyn finished the nav course 40 minutes inside the cutoff, came in 4th overall, and didn't mention it to anyone. On the firing line, the story was more complicated. She was technically proficient at distances up to 600 yards. Her cold bore shots were consistent. Her position adjustments were clean, and her reading of the mirage indicators that rippled above the hot desert floor was better than most of the candidates after a full week of instruction. But consistent and technically proficient were not words that generated attention in a room full of men who'd spent years crafting their identities around shooting. What generated attention was flash, the shot that made other shooters stop and look. The one-hole group at distance, the wind red that seemed almost psychic, the impossible correction that nobody else saw coming. She didn't have that, not yet. What she had was something harder to explain and considerably harder to defend in a room where nobody was looking to be convinced. She had patience. She had the particular kind of quiet that came from years of sitting in a Wyoming hunting blind at 4 a.m. in February while the wind tried to push through every gap in her layering, waiting for a shot that might come or might not, and being equally ready for either outcome. Her grandfather had spent 11 years teaching her that the shot wasn't the point. The preparation was the point. The shot was just what happened at the end of preparation. And if the preparation was right, the shot almost took care of itself. She didn't know how to explain that to the man next to her on the firing line, who had a spotting scope tattooed on his forearm and strong opinions about barrel twist rates, and was currently betting $200 with the man on his other side that she'd wash out by week 4. She knew about the bet. Staff Sergeant Drew Calloway, the spotter assigned to work with her during live fire exercises, had mentioned it with a slight wince on day 5, like he was apologizing for something he hadn't personally done. "Thought you should know," Calloway said. He was 26 from rural Arkansas and had a way of delivering uncomfortable information with the directness of someone who'd grown up where people said what they meant. "It's not everyone, but it's not nothing either." "How much is in the pool total?" He blinked. Last I heard, maybe $800? She did the math. 8 people out of 12. Higher than I expected. The other 4 didn't have cash on them, he said, which was either a joke or a clarification. She still wasn't sure. "What's your bet?" He was quiet for a second. "I don't bet on people." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let it go. He was a decent spotter, methodical, with good natural range estimation skills, and an eye for environmental data that would improve significantly with experience. She had no reason to make his life harder. Colonel Hale's particular approach to Evelyn's training revealed itself gradually over the first 2 weeks, the way a bruise develops, not all at once, but building incrementally until you couldn't ignore it. It started with the march assignments. The LRPF course built in 2 extended ruck marches per week, distances ranging from 12 to 20 kilometers with full kit plus rifle. The standard assignment was randomized by class roster rotation. But Evelyn noticed by the 3rd week that her name appeared at the top of the extended assignments with a statistical regularity that exceeded coincidence. When the longest march of the week was 20 kilometers, she was on it. When there was an optional 12-hour observation exercise that started at midnight, her name was on the secondary list that filled in when primary candidates dropped out, regardless of whether she'd been on the primary list or not. She said nothing. She also said nothing when the shooting scenarios assigned to her during tactical evaluation days seemed consistently calibrated upward from the rest of the class. Longer distances, tighter time windows, targets positioned in shadow rather than open terrain where environmental indicators were harder to read. The other candidates noticed. How could they not? Staff Sergeant Reeves, the thick-necked master sergeant from the van, who turned out to be a reasonable shot with poor wind-reading skills and a grudging respect for competence, mentioned it to her during a water break on the 4th week. "Hale's riding you," Reeves said flatly. He had a way of stating things that other people danced around. "Noted," she said. "I'm not saying it to start something. I'm saying it because it's obvious and someone should acknowledge it to your face instead of just talking about it when you're not around." She looked at him. He had a deep crease between his eyebrows from years of squinting, and he was looking at her the way men with his particular kind of record looked at things they'd decided to take seriously. "What do people say when I'm not around?" "The usual, that Hale's testing you harder because he wants you to fail and has to document the attempt. That you're only here because someone pushed your file through. That your first week scores were inflated because the evaluators were..." He stopped. "Were what?" "Afraid to score you accurately in case it looked like bias." She absorbed that. It was almost elegant in its circularity. She was either underscored to push her out or overscored to avoid the appearance of bias, and neither version of events required her to be actually good at anything. "What do you think?" she asked. Reeves took a long drink from his water bottle. "I think your cold bore shot on day 9 was one of the cleanest I've ever seen at that distance." "That's not what I asked." "No?" he said. "It's not." He recapped his water bottle and stood up. "I think Hale has a theory about this class, and you're going to spend 12 weeks either proving him right or proving him wrong, and I think you already know which one it is." He walked back toward the firing line. Her grandfather's name was Walt Cross, and he'd served 2 tours in Vietnam as an Army Ranger before coming home to the family property outside Lander, Wyoming, where he'd spent the next 4 decades doing things with a rifle that defied easy explanation. He wasn't a competition shooter. He'd never wanted to be. What he was, in a way that had shaped Evelyn more profoundly than anything she'd encountered in 8 years of military service, was a man who understood the relationship between stillness and accuracy at a nearly philosophical level. He'd started taking her to the range when she was 9 years old. Not the shooting range. He didn't use ranges, thought they created artificial conditions that produced artificial shooters. He took her to the hillside behind the lower fence line, where the terrain broke into a series of draws and ridges, and he taught her to find stable positions in unstable terrain, to use what the land gave her, rather than demanding conditions that didn't exist. He taught her to read the wind, not from flags or kestrels, but from the way grass moved in the depression 300 yards out, where the actual air the bullet would travel through was already telling you what it intended to do. "You're not fighting the wind," he told her once, when she was maybe 12 and furious at a missed shot. "You're making a deal with it. You have to know what it wants before you can ask for anything in return." She thought that was mystical nonsense until she was about 15, and it suddenly wasn't anymore. Walt Cross had died 4 years ago, on a February morning in a hospital in Riverton, from complications following a surgery that should have been routine. She'd flown home from Fort Bragg on emergency leave and made it with 6 hours to spare. He'd been conscious. He'd held her hand and looked at her with the particular quality of attention he'd always had. Complete, unrattled, as if the most important thing in his immediate environment was always the thing directly in front of him. "You hold," he told her. The same thing he'd always said when she was about to break position under pressure. Hold meaning not just the physical position, but the internal one. The place you came from before the noise started. She'd held. She still held. She held through week 5 of LRPF when Hale assigned her a field observation exercise that required 20 hours of prone position maintenance in direct sun without shade, looking for a simulated target, an actor in civilian clothes, who would appear somewhere within a designated 600-meter arc at some point within the window. Most observation exercises ran 12 hours. She completed it, reported the target with a precise 8-digit grid coordinate and a detailed description of clothing, movement pattern, and the FAO .45 caliber pistol worn under a light jacket on the left hip that she'd spotted during a 3-second window when the wind moved his jacket 43 minutes into his appearance. The evaluator reviewing her report had gone quiet for a long moment. "The concealed firearm isn't part of the scenario," he said. "I know," she said. He put the report down. "How'd you make the pistol at that distance?" "The jacket sat differently on the left side than the right. Weight distribution. When the wind moved it, I had about 3 seconds and a clean angle." He made a note. She had no idea what the note said. The rumors circulating through the barracks by week 6 had evolved, the way rumors do under pressure. They mutated, subdivided, and cross-pollinated with people's existing beliefs until they barely resembled their original forms. The original story, "She's here because of administrative pressure, she'll wash out by week 4, had been revised in light of her actual performance, but revised in a way that managed to avoid giving her any genuine credit. New theory, circulating through the class with varying degrees of subtlety. She was technically proficient, but emotionally cold, which, in a long-range shooting context, was supposedly a liability because experienced shooters needed to be able to perform under emotional pressure. And someone who'd shut down her emotional responses might score well in evaluation exercises, but would freeze when the stakes were real. She heard this particular version from Calloway, who delivered it with the same apologetic wince as before. "Who's pushing that one?" she asked. "Couple of guys, Sergeant Mora mostly. He's got a theory. Mora's reading of windage is consistently off by 3 to 5 kilometers per hour at distances past 700 yards, she said. His theory about my emotional regulation might benefit from more attention to his own technical deficiencies." Calloway blinked. "You want me to tell him that?" "No," she said. "I want you to let him keep thinking what he thinks." "Why?" She picked up her rifle and checked the 0. "Because people who think you're cold and checked out stop watching you as carefully, and right now I'd rather be underestimated than overanalyzed." Calloway was quiet for a second. "That's kind of cold," he said. "Yep," she agreed, and started her breathing sequence. Titcom. Colonel Hale called her into his office on the evening of day 44. 6 weeks into the course, right at the traditional midpoint pressure test, where instructors either formally addressed deficiencies or gave candidates the tacit signal that they were tracking toward qualification. His office was spare. A desk, 2 chairs, a topographic map of the Black Ridge training area pinned to the wall, and a single framed photograph of a younger Hale in full kit outside a FOB she didn't recognize, arms around 2 other soldiers whose faces she couldn't see. No awards, no commendations, no decorative display of accumulated achievement. Either he was indifferent to those things, or he kept them somewhere else. He was looking at a folder on his desk when she came in. "Sit down, Captain." She sat. He looked at the folder for another moment before he looked at her. "Your evaluation scores are tracking in the top third of the class." "Yes, sir." "Your physical performance has been consistent. Your observation reports are detailed. Your cold bore accuracy at distance is better than average." He closed the folder. "None of that tells me what I need to know." "Which is what, sir?" "Whether you break," he said simply. "Every candidate I've processed through this course who eventually failed did so after a point where their metrics looked fine. Performance degraded later, when the conditions became genuinely unreasonable. Not just hard, unreasonable." He paused. "Can you tell the difference? Between hard and unreasonable? Between conditions you can adapt to and conditions that exceed your adaptation threshold." She thought about that for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give him the honest one rather than the one that sounded good. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what I've been through. I don't know where my ceiling is." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't completely read. Something shifted in it, briefly. Not warmth, nothing that generous, but something like genuine evaluation replacing whatever performance he'd been running before. "That's an honest answer," he said. "It's the accurate one. Those aren't always the same thing." He stood up, which was her signal. "What I'm going to tell you is what I tell every candidate at this juncture. The back half of this course is calibrated to exceed what you think you're capable of. Some of that calibration will feel personal. It isn't. What looks like targeting is pressure management. Do you understand the distinction?" She stood. "I understand the distinction, sir. Whether it reflects the reality of what's happening is a different question." He looked at her for just a moment. "Dismissed, Captain." Week 7 was when things got genuinely difficult. The course introduced what the syllabus referred to as dynamic engagement scenarios. Live fire exercises where the target array, the candidate's position, and the environmental conditions all changed simultaneously and without prior notification. You might be given a firing position at 0600. That was scrapped by 0610 because a range safety flag indicated wind conditions had exceeded safe parameters at the primary position, which meant relocating to a secondary position that you had 4 minutes to prepare, at a distance you were given upon arrival and not before. The scenarios were legitimate by the standards of what advanced precision shooter training was supposed to accomplish. They were also, in ways Evelyn tracked carefully, applied differently to her than to the rest of the class. The most obvious instance came on day 51. The morning's scheduled exercise was a standard 2-position relay, all 12 remaining candidates cycling through position Alpha and position Bravo in assigned pairs, each pair given 60 minutes to engage a target array at varying distances. The assignments had been posted the previous evening. She was paired with Callaway, assigned to the first relay, position Alpha. At 0745, 15 minutes before first relay was supposed to start, Sergeant Mora pulled her aside. Mora was one of the course's assistant instructors, nominally responsible for range safety and scenario briefing. He had the clipped manner of someone who believed efficiency and discourtesy were the same thing. "Change of assignment," he said. "You're pulling solo evaluation today. No spotter. Position Charlie." She looked at him. "Charlie isn't on the day's posted schedule." "It is now." "When was this decision made?" "This morning." "Who approved the change?" "Colonel Hale." "Is this a formal modification to my evaluation record or an informal supplemental?" He blinked. "It's an assignment, Captain." "I understand that. I'm asking whether it's being documented in my official evaluation file or whether it's an informal scenario that won't appear in my record." The blinking continued, more slowly. "I'll have to check on that." "I'll wait," she said. He walked away. He came back 9 minutes later with a slightly adjusted expression that suggested he'd had a conversation that hadn't gone the way he expected. "It'll be documented," he said. "Thank you," she said. "What's the target distance and the engagement window?" 780 yards, single shot, no spotter, 30 seconds. Wind data? Current readings are on the board at position Charlie. What was the wind doing an hour ago? He paused. I'll check the range log, she said, and walked past him toward the observation shed where the range meteorological logs were kept. She had 12 minutes before her start time. She used 10 of them reading every wind entry from the previous 4 hours, building a picture of how the air across the range was behaving before she'd seen a single flag. Position. Charlie was a dugout firing position, a fighting hole with a corrugated lip, about 30 meters back from the natural berm that lined the western edge of the main range complex. The target, a standard 12-inch steel plate on a collapsible frame, was visible as a small dark rectangle through her scope at the full 780 yards, sitting in full sun on the downrange berm. She had no spotter. That meant no wind calls from a second set of eyes, no confirmation of range, no backup reading of the mirage. What she had was the information she'd collected from the range logs, the current flags at the 200-yard and 400-yard marks, and whatever the grass was doing in the depression between her position and the target. She spent 8 of her 30 seconds doing nothing but watching the grass. The flag said west at 8 to 10 knots, consistent. The grass disagreed slightly. It was bending with a mild south component that the flags were missing, which meant the prevailing data understated the lateral push in the last 200 yards of the bullet's flight. She made a 3/4 MOA left holdover that the flags alone wouldn't have suggested, settled her breathing, and broke the shot at the 22-second mark. The steel rang. She didn't move. She kept the reticle on the impact point and listened to the ring fade. Behind her, maybe 20 meters back, she heard Hale's voice. "Mark time of shot." She hadn't known he was there. She stayed in position until she heard him walk forward to the firing station. "Turn in your rifle," he said. "Sir?" "Walk with me." She cleared the rifle, safed it, and followed him back along the range access road. He walked with his hands behind his back, and he didn't speak for the first 90 seconds. "You asked Mora whether the modification would be documented," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I wanted to know whether it counted," she said. "Why does that matter?" "Because if it doesn't count, it's just harassment. If it counts, it's evaluation." He was quiet for another 50 meters. "You pulled the range logs before you shot," he said. "Standard preparation, sir." There was no time in the scenario for standard preparation. "I made time." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. The sun was already significant by 0900, and the shadow of the berm to their west was retreating fast across the hard pan as the light climbed. "You read the wind from the grass instead of the flags," he said. The flags were missing a south component. "How much?" "Enough to matter at 780. He looked at her. Fully, the way he hadn't looked at her in his office. Not the performance, not the assessment, but the actual man making an actual judgment. "Where'd you learn to read grass like that?" he said. "My grandfather taught me," she said. "Wyoming, high desert country. We didn't always have flags." Something crossed his face that she couldn't name and wasn't going to try. He looked away toward the downrange berm where the steel target was just visible as a dark spot, still in the sun. "There's a Phase 2 dynamic scenario in Week 9, he said. "It will be substantially more difficult than what you did today." "I understand, sir. The conditions will be genuinely unreasonable." He said the last 2 words with a particular weight, the way someone says something for the second time when they expect you to hear it differently. She nodded once. Dismissed. She walked back toward the barracks along the range road, alone in the building heat of the Nevada morning, and she did not allow herself to think about what Week 9 would bring. Not because she wasn't thinking it, but because holding the present was the only preparation that mattered, and she was, if nothing else, very good at holding. Behind her, she heard Hale's boots on the hardpan, moving in the other direction, toward the observation shed, or the range office, or wherever he went when he was working something out. She kept walking. Somewhere across the compound, the rest of the class was cycling through Position Alpha and Position Bravo, trading wind calls and building the easy kind of confidence that came from a fair relay in good conditions. Let them, she thought. Week 9 was coming, and she already knew it wasn't going to look anything like what the syllabus said. What she didn't know, what no one had told her, because no one but Hale knew yet, was that Week 9 had been redesigned in the last 48 hours, specifically, deliberately, with a target distance and environmental challenge that no candidate in the history of Black Ridge had been asked to replicate under a live evaluation clock. And Hale had scheduled it for a Tuesday, when the forecasters were calling for a significant storm front to roll in off the Sierra Nevada by afternoon. He was building something. She could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before the weather arrives, in the quality of the silence, in the particular flatness of the air, in the way the horizon seemed to compress in the late afternoon light. Something was coming, and Colonel Marcus Hale had made very sure that when it arrived, every person on this installation would be standing there to watch. The storm didn't arrive on Tuesday. It arrived on Monday evening instead, ahead of schedule, the way Nevada weather always seemed to do things, without announcement, without apology, and with a particular contempt for anyone who'd been counting on the forecast. By 2100 hours, the sky had gone from clear to a low, churning gray that swallowed the stars. And by midnight, the wind was moving across the installation in sustained gusts that rattled the barracks windows and drove fine grit under every door seal. Evelyn lay on her bunk and listened to it. She wasn't the only one awake. She could hear Calloway shifting on the bunk above hers, the subtle creak of the frame that meant he was lying there with his eyes open, same as her. 3 bunks down, someone was running a thumbnail along the edge of a field manual's spine in a slow, repetitive scrape. Nervous habit. She didn't know who it was and didn't look. The barracks smelled like dust and gun oil and the particular sweat of people who'd been working hard in desert heat for 7 weeks. She'd stopped noticing it after the first 10 days. Now it was just the smell of the place, same as the smell of the wind coming off the high desert, same as the smell of the range when the brass was hot and the cordite hung in the air. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to inventory. Her right shoulder had a deep ache in the trapezius from a ruck march 2 days ago, where she'd shifted her load incorrectly over a rocky scramble section and paid for it for the next 6 kilometers. It wasn't debilitating. It would tighten further in the morning cold and loosen after the first hour of movement. She'd managed worse. Her 0 was current. She'd reconfirmed it that afternoon on the short range. 3 rounds at 200 yards, group size inside an inch, point of impact exactly where she'd set it. The rifle was clean. The scope was clean. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. What couldn't be controlled was the storm, and whatever Hale had built inside Week 9, and the 48 hours between now and then. She turned onto her side and thought about the grass in the depression. Week 8 arrived with the particular cruelty of a course that had been patient long enough. The storm that came through Monday night deposited 2 inches of rain on the hard pan, which the desert promptly refused to absorb, and by Tuesday morning the main range access road was a shallow lake of red-brown mud that sucked at boots and made every transit between positions a slow, grinding negotiation. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees. The wind was running west-northwest at 22 knots with gusts to 38, sustained, the kind of wind that turned a difficult shot into an exercise in probabilistic thinking. Colonel Hale called the class to the range briefing at 0730. He was already there when they arrived, standing in front of a whiteboard with a topographic overlay of the range complex pinned to it, dry despite the mud on every available surface. Either he'd arrived very early, or he simply didn't get mud on him. Current conditions, he said without preamble. Wind west-northwest, 20 to 25 sustained, gusts to 38. Ground saturation is making position alpha unusable. We're moving primary operations to Delta and Foxtrot for the week. This is not a schedule change. This is a conditions adaptation. If you cannot adapt your practice to changing conditions, you cannot do this job. He looked at the class. Precision shooting in degraded conditions is not a special circumstance. It is the circumstance. The only shooting that ever mattered happened in conditions someone called impossible beforehand. He paused. Calloway. Sir? What's your current dope at 700 yards in this wind? Calloway hesitated half a second. Approximately 4 MOA right, sir, possibly 4.5 given the gusts. Approximately, Hale repeated, not unkindly, but not gently. Cross. She answered before the silence could develop any weight. 4.2 MOA right at sustained. I'd hold 4.8 and break on a lull, sir. The gusts are irregular enough that waiting for a 3-second window between them is more reliable than trying to calculate through them. The room was quiet. Hale looked at her for a moment. On what basis? Range logs from the last 4 hours show the gusts are cycling on roughly an 8 to 12-second interval. Long enough to get a stable read, short enough that you can't hold through. Better to identify the cycle and time the shot into the low point. He looked at her for another beat. Then he wrote something on the edge of the whiteboard without explaining what it was, turned back to the class, and continued the brief. Sergeant Mora, standing to Hale's left, was looking at his boots. The week's live fire exercises were genuinely hard, and not in the calibrated, pedagogically intentional way the earlier weeks had been hard. The conditions made them hard in the way that actual field conditions were hard, ugly and imprecise, with variables that didn't resolve cleanly, where the right answer was sometimes this shot cannot be made reliably, and the decision to take it anyway is its own kind of error. They ran 4-man relay shoots from position delta, which sat at the top of a natural ridgeline and caught the full crosswind. The targets were steel plates at 500, 700, and 900 yards, and the evaluators were running time-on-target metrics, not just whether you hit, but how long it took you to set up, acquire, and engage. First-round hits at distance in these conditions were generating a 40 to 50% success rate across the class, which Hale acknowledged without commentary, which was somehow more pointed than commentary. On day 2 of the week, Evelyn had a sequence she couldn't make work. The shot was a 700-yard engagement from a hastily constructed firing position behind a natural rock outcrop. One of the expedient position exercises where candidates were given a terrain feature and 4 minutes to build a stable supported shooting platform using whatever was available. The wind was cycling hard, the rock surface was angled slightly wrong for her natural point of aim, and the shimmer of mirage above the wet desert floor was playing tricks with the target's apparent position. She broke the shot at the wrong moment. She knew at the instant the trigger broke. She'd read a lull that wasn't actually there, anticipating the cycle rather than observing it. The round missed left by about 8 inches, clearly visible through her scope as a puff of dirt that told a whole story in 2 seconds. She didn't move. She stayed in position, worked the bolt, reacquired, waited through a full cycle, and hit the second shot cleanly. But the first miss was in the log. In the debrief that afternoon, Hale went through each candidate's session individually. When he got to hers, he put the log sheet down. 700. First round miss, second round hit. Talk me through it. I anticipated the wind cycle instead of observing it. I thought I had a read on the pattern, and I acted on the assumption instead of the data. What was the observable difference between the moment you shot and an actual lull? The grass in the low ground was still moving. I was reading the flags and ignoring what was closer. He made a note. Not a grade, just a note. That's an honest assessment, he said. It was a mistake, she said. Yes, the question is whether it was a mistake you understand or a mistake you'll repeat. He moved on to the next candidate. After the debrief, walking back toward the barracks in the cooling late afternoon, Calloway fell into step beside her. First miss in 40-something days, he said. First documented miss, she corrected. I've pulled shots in training that weren't being logged. You know what I mean. It was a bad read. It happens. Mora was smiling during the debrief. She'd noticed. Mora had the kind of smile he probably thought was neutral, but was actually a very thin disguise for satisfaction. She'd filed it and moved on. Let him, she said. He's writing something in that notebook he carries. Has been for a week. Every time you do something, he writes in the notebook. She thought about that. What kind of notebook? Green, narrow-ruled, the army issue kind. Official or personal? Couldn't tell. She kept walking. If Mora was building a documentation file, it could go one of 2 ways. Either he was generating evidence of her deficiencies for Hale's use in a formal evaluation downgrade, which was his right and arguably his responsibility as an assistant instructor, or he was doing something else with it, something more personal, which was a different problem with different implications. Keep watching it, she said. The notebook? Whether it's official or personal. If he hands it to Hale, that's one thing. If it goes somewhere else, that's another. Calloway was quiet for a step. You think he'd go outside the chain? I think some people build files for protection, and some people build files for leverage, she said. I don't know which one he is yet. Chat. The exercise on day 4 of week 8 was the one she'd remember later. It wasn't the hardest thing she'd done at Blackridge. That was still to come, still a week away. But it was the exercise that shifted something in the class's collective understanding of her, the moment when a significant portion of the people who'd been watching and waiting and betting finally had to recalibrate. The scenario was a simulated combat observation exercise, the kind of problem that bridged pure marksmanship with the intelligence collection function that precision shooters actually performed in the field. Each candidate was taken, individually and without prior notice, to a concealed observation position on the ridge above the main range and given a 12-hour window to observe a simulated objective area below, a mocked-up compound comprising 4 structures, an improvised vehicle park, and various personnel movement that was generated by a rotating crew of role players who'd been given specific behavioral scripts. The candidate's task was to produce an intelligence report, personnel count, movement patterns, identified leadership indicators, any weaponry observed, and an assessment of the most likely point of vulnerability for a direct action mission. It was not a shooting exercise. No live fire, no targets, just observation, documentation, and judgment. She went in at 0500 and came out at 1700. Her report ran to 4 pages. It identified 11 distinct individuals in the objective area over the course of the day, tracked 6 of them to specific structures with high confidence, noted that one individual, dressed similarly to the others but moving with a different behavioral pattern, checking his watch more frequently, and positioning himself consistently to maintain line of sight to the northern approach road, was either a lookout or a leadership figure, probably both. She'd sketched his face from memory at 600 meters with enough accuracy that the debrief evaluator, looking at the provided photograph of the role player, compared it twice before confirming. She'd also noted in a section of the report marked additional observations that the role player managing the vehicle park had been using a cell phone with an unusual frequency, 32 times in 12 hours, always stepping slightly away from the vehicle area before using it, which suggested he was either violating a communications protocol he was aware of or reporting to someone outside the scenario. She noted that if this were real, it would represent a significant OPSEC concern for the objective, and recommended the debrief team flag it for the role player's coordinator. The role player coordinator, as it turned out, had given that specific role player no instruction about cell phone usage. The man had been doing it on his own, out of habit. Nobody had noticed until her report identified it. The debrief was conducted by a lieutenant colonel she'd never seen before, brought in from somewhere else, introduced only as an observer, which was the military's polite word for someone who outranked the people doing the assessment and was checking whether they were doing it correctly. Walk me through your leadership identification methodology, the lieutenant colonel said. She walked him through it, behavioral indicators, movement economics, the specific way the individual's eyes tracked the approach road versus the interior of the compound, the watch-checking frequency, the positioning that maximized his own observation angle. You identified the cell phone usage without being prompted. It was in my observation window. It wasn't in anyone else's report. I can't speak to other people's reports, sir. He looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read because it had spent a long time being deliberately difficult to read. No, you can't. He made a note, the same kind of note Hale made. Not a grade, something more complicated. Outside the debrief room in the narrow hallway that ran between the administrative offices, she almost walked into Sergeant Mora. He was holding the green notebook. He looked at her with a particular expression, not the masked satisfaction from before, but something closer to reassessment, the look of someone who'd been running one calculation and suddenly suspected the numbers were different than they'd thought. He didn't say anything, neither did she. She walked past him down the hallway, and she heard behind her the sound of him opening the notebook, the faint creak of the cover, and then, after a moment, closing it again without writing anything. That night in the barracks, the dynamic shifted in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nobody made a speech. Nobody apologized. What happened was smaller than that and therefore more real. The particular kind of social recalibration that happens in close quarters environments when a group of people simultaneously update their models of another person without formally acknowledging they're doing it. Reeves stopped into her bay on his way back from the showers, towel over his shoulder, and spent 4 minutes discussing windage compensation at distance in a way that assumed she had something worth contributing to the conversation. He didn't mention the observation exercise or the debrief report. He talked about wind. But the way he talked about it was different from how he'd talked to her before. Less instructional, more lateral. The way soldiers talk to other soldiers they've decided to take seriously. Two of the other candidates, Yarbrough, a quiet warrant officer from Georgia, and Decker, a staff sergeant who'd said approximately 40 words in 7 weeks, stopped in the corridor outside the bay and stood there for a moment before Yarbrough said, without looking directly at her, "Good report today." That was the entirety of the interaction. Then they kept walking. Calloway, sitting on his bunk cleaning his scope caps, waited until the corridor was empty before he looked at her. "You knew about the cell phone thing before you wrote it, didn't you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I observed it during the window." "That's not what I'm asking." She considered the question. "I noticed about 4 hours in that the pattern was off. I spent the next 8 hours watching to see if it was consistent." "You watched a guy use his phone for 8 hours. I was watching a lot of things. He was one of them, and you put it in the report even though it wasn't part of the scenario. It was in my observation window." He looked at her for a moment. "Where'd you learn to do that?" She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated. Part combat, part her grandfather, part 8 years of field work that had never fully separated observation from instinct. She'd spent enough time in environments where the thing that would kill you wasn't the obvious thing that it had changed the way she looked at the world. She didn't see spaces anymore the way she'd seen them before her first deployment. She saw threat geometry, entry points, behavioral anomalies. It wasn't something she'd cultivated deliberately. It had just accumulated, the way silt accumulates on a riverbed, slow, consistent, invisible, until suddenly it's changed the depth of the water. "I don't know," she said. "I think I've always noticed things." Calloway nodded slowly, the way people nod when they believe you, but also know there's more to it than what you've said. He went back to cleaning his scope caps. Day 6 of week 8. 5:30 PT had just ended, and the class was moving toward the chow hall in the thin early light when Hale appeared on the path between the motor pool and the main building, walking in the opposite direction, and Evelyn fell slightly behind the group. Not intentionally, just the natural slow settling of someone whose shoulder was tight in the cold. Hale passed the group without stopping, but as he passed her specifically, without slowing and without looking at her, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "Week 9 briefing Thursday at 1800. Attend in uniform." Then he was past. She kept walking. The rest of the group was 3 steps ahead. Thursday was 2 days away. A separate briefing after hours in uniform, which meant formal, which meant it was going to be documented, which meant whatever he was telling her at Thursday's briefing was going on record. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. Through breakfast and the morning's technical instruction block on environmental effects on terminal ballistics, and she thought about it during the afternoon's dry fire practice sequence when the wind had died completely and the range had the particular stillness of a place holding its breath. Something was coming. She'd known it since week 6, but coming had felt abstract until now. And now it didn't feel abstract at all. It felt like a Thursday briefing in formal uniform and a storm front that was already rebuilding over the Sierra Nevada, according to the Range Weather Board, which showed the next significant weather system projected to arrive over Black Ridge between Wednesday night and Friday morning, which meant Week 9's significant event, whatever Hale had redesigned in the last 48 hours, was going to happen in weather. She ate her dinner without tasting it. In the bay afterward, she pulled out her personal logbook. She'd been keeping her own records parallel to the official evaluation log, something her grandfather had taught her. Write everything down. Your memory lies to you when you're under pressure. And she reviewed her wine data from the last 8 weeks. She was looking for patterns, not just in the wind, but in the range itself, the way the terrain funneled air, where the shearing occurred, how the depression between position delta and the far berm behaved differently at different times of day. She'd been collecting this data without a specific application in mind, the same way she'd always collected things, because her grandfather had told her that the shot you have to make eventually is never the shot you expected. And the preparation you did last month is what saves you when this month goes wrong. She thought about the steel target at 780 yards in the observation exercise. And she thought about Hale's face when she'd told him about the grass. And she thought about the storm that was already beginning to rebuild over the mountains to the west. She thought about Thursday at 1800. She closed the logbook and looked at the ceiling. 2 bunks over, Yarbrough had gone to sleep already, his breathing the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who'd learned to sleep on command. Out through the small rectangular window above her bunk, the sky was clear for the moment, dark and cold and crowded with stars in the particular way of high desert nights when the dust had settled. She watched the stars for a while. Then she pulled the logbook back out and kept writing. She was still writing when the 2,200 lights out call came through, and she finished by memory in the dark, the pen moving without needing to see the page, because some things you can do without light once you've done them enough times. Outside, far to the west, something that might have been thunder, or might have been nothing at all rolled once across the mountains, and then went silent. She capped the pen. She lay in the dark and listened to the desert settle around her, and she thought about everything she'd built in 8 weeks, every wind read and every note and every early morning and every moment she'd held when she could have moved, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that all of it had been leading to something she hadn't seen yet, and that whatever it was going to arrive whether she was ready or not. She decided to be ready. Somewhere across the installation, a door opened and closed, footsteps on gravel, fading. Then just the wind and the dark and the stars going out one by one as the clouds came in from the west. Thursday came in cold. The temperature had dropped another 8 degrees overnight, and by the time the 0530 PT formation assembled on the hardpan outside the barracks, the candidate's breath was coming out in visible puffs that the wind immediately shredded. The sky to the west had gone the color of old pewter, not threatening yet, but building, the clouds piling up against the ridgeline in slow, deliberate stacks that suggested the storm wasn't asking permission. Evelyn ran her 6 kilometers in 41 minutes on legs that wanted to cramp in the cold, pushed through the bodyweight circuit that followed, showered in water that took 3 full minutes to get warm, ate breakfast without appetite, and spent the morning in a ballistics instruction block that she'd already internalized so completely she could have taught it. She took notes anyway. The act of writing kept her hands busy and her mind from running too far ahead of itself. Nobody mentioned the 1800 briefing. She hadn't told anyone about it, and if Hale had told anyone else, they were keeping it the same way. The afternoon was dry fire practice at Position Delta, working on position transitions under time pressure. Building, breaking, and rebuilding a stable firing platform in under 90 seconds across 3 different terrain surfaces. She did it 17 times. The 17th was the best. Not because she was trying harder, but because somewhere around the 12th repetition, her body stopped arguing with the process and just did it. The way physical skills sometimes dropped into a different register after enough repetition, becoming less about decision and more about something closer to reflex. At 17:45, she changed into clean AC-us, laced her boots correctly, and walked to Hale's office. He wasn't alone. That was the first thing she registered when she knocked, and he told her to come in. The lieutenant colonel from the observation debrief, the one introduced only as an observer, was sitting in the chair to the left of Hale's desk, wearing the particular stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and understood exactly what they were. His name, she learned in the next 30 seconds, was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Vane, and he was attached to the Army's Sniper School Advisory Group out of Fort Benning. He had a thin file on his knee that she couldn't read from where she was standing. "At ease," Hale said. "Sit down." She sat in the remaining chair. The 3 of them formed a triangle in the small office, the topographic map behind Hale's head, the single window to her right showing the darkening sky, and the first suggestions of the weather coming in off the mountains. "You know why you're here," Hale said. "I assumed it was related to Week 9's scenario, sir." "Partly." He glanced at Vane, a brief look that transferred something she couldn't quite decode. Colonel Vane has been on site since day 4 of this course as an independent evaluator. His presence was not disclosed to candidates as standard protocol. He's been reviewing performance data across the class, and has submitted a separate assessment to my chain alongside my own evaluation records. She kept her expression neutral. Understood, sir. Vane leaned forward slightly. Captain Cross, your observation report from day 4 of week 8 was forwarded to my office for review. I had some questions about your methodology. He opened the thin file. You tracked the cell phone usage of role player 4 across a 12-hour window and flagged it as an OPSEC anomaly. Walk me through the decision to include that in the report. It was in my observation window and it appeared to represent a deviation from expected behavioral pattern, sir. I flagged it because in a real-world context it would represent an intelligence value. It wasn't in the scenario brief. No, sir. The scenario brief specifically limited the reporting requirement to personnel count, movement pattern, leadership indicators, and vulnerabilities assessment. Yes, sir. I included the cell phone observation as an addendum to the primary report, clearly noted as outside the primary reporting requirement. Vane looked at her for a moment. Why? She thought about it. Because if I'm doing this job in the field and I see something that matters, I don't stop seeing it because it wasn't in the brief. The brief tells me what I'm looking for. It doesn't tell me what's there. Silence. The wind moved against the window. Vane wrote something in the file. The role player's coordinator reviewed the behavior after your report flagged it. The individual was using a personal cell phone on the range in violation of range communications security protocol. He received a formal counseling statement. I didn't know that, sir. No. But your report made it possible. He closed the file. I'm going to be present at the week 9 evaluation scenario. That's all I wanted you to know. She looked at Hale. Hale had his hands flat on the desk, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd worked out carefully in advance. Week 9's primary live fire evaluation has been modified, he said. Original scenario called for a 900-yard engagement from position foxtrot under standard evaluation parameters. That scenario is suspended. He paused. What you'll be doing instead is a solo qualification attempt at 940 yards from position echo. No spotter, single shot. The engagement window is 60 seconds from the moment the range safety flag drops. Conditions will be whatever Thursday's weather provides. She looked at him steadily. What are current forecasts, sir? Sustained winds 25 to 35, gusts to 45. 70% chance of rain beginning between 1400 and 1600 hours Thursday. And the rest of the class? The rest of the class will run the standard 900-yard scenario from Foxtrot. He looked at her without apology. This modification applies to you specifically. She absorbed that. The rest of the class, 900 yards, standard conditions, spotter support, evaluation parameters built over 12 weeks of progressive preparation. And her, 940 yards solo in what was essentially a storm with 60 seconds in one round. Is this modification documented in my official evaluation record, sir? It is. Is a first-round hit under these conditions sufficient for qualification? Hale looked at her with an expression she still couldn't fully categorize. A first-round hit under these conditions, he said slowly, would be sufficient for more than qualification. The room was quiet for a moment. Any other questions, Captain? No, sir. Thursday, 1500 hours, position echo. Don't be late. She didn't sleep well Wednesday night. That was the honest truth of it. She lay on her bunk for 6 hours and got maybe 3 of actual sleep, broken into 2 chunks with a 90-minute gap in the middle where she was simply awake, staring at the underside of Calloway's bunk and listening to the wind pick up outside. She didn't fight it. Trying to force sleep was worse than lying still and letting the body rest even if the mind wasn't fully down. She'd learned that in the field, learned it the hard way actually, on a surveillance rotation in a country she couldn't name in a conversation, where she'd burned herself out trying to sleep on command and spent the last 16 hours of the rotation running on empty in a way that had scared her more than the threat environment. She lay still and let her mind do what it was going to do. It went to the terrain, which was probably the most useful place it could have gone. She traced position echo in her memory. She'd been to it twice during the course, once as part of a group orientation and once during the observation exercise on day 4, when she'd used it as a transit point between positions. Echo was a slot cut into the natural ridge line. a narrow notch of rock and compacted earth with a firing ledge that had been improved with sandbag revetment sometime in the last year, the bag starting to deteriorate at the corners, leaching rust-colored sand. The slot ran roughly east-west, which meant a shooter in the slot was oriented downrange to the east and exposed to cross-traffic from the north and south. The wind at Echo would be different from the wind at Delta or Foxtrot. She knew this from the range logs, had been tracking it for weeks without knowing exactly why. The same habit of collecting everything and sorting it later. At Echo, the ridgeline to the north created a deflection that pushed the prevailing westerly wind into a slight south component below the slot level, similar to what she'd read at position Charlie on day 51, but more pronounced because of the angle of the northern ridge. The standard wind flags on the range were positioned to read the prevailing condition, not the deflected condition. They would understate the south push at the impact end by 2 to 3 MOA, maybe more in strong conditions. She filed that. 940 yards was not an impossible distance. She'd engaged targets at that range before. Not under these conditions, not solo, not with 60 seconds in one round, but the distance itself wasn't the problem. The problem was the variable stack. Distance, plus wind, plus rain, plus no spotter, plus time limit, plus the fact that every instructor on the installation was apparently going to be watching. She thought about what Hale had said. A first-round hit under these conditions would be sufficient for more than qualification. She thought about what that meant. Then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about what it meant was the wrong direction. What mattered was the grass in the depression. What mattered was reading the actual wind, not the theoretical wind. What mattered was 60 seconds and a trigger press and the decision that preceded it. Her grandfather had told her once, after a shot she'd made at nearly 1,000 yards on a day when the wind was doing something genuinely unreasonable, that the reason most people missed long shots wasn't technical failure. It was that they added a layer of performance to the process. They stopped shooting and started trying to prove something, to the wind or the distance or the people watching, and the moment that happened, the shot was already compromised. Because you can't serve two purposes at once. You're either shooting or you're proving. You can't do both. She breathed in, she breathed out. She went to sleep. Thursday morning ran like any other day, which she appreciated. PT at 0530, Chow at 0700, a morning instruction block on elevation correction that had the class sitting in a classroom with the windows showing the darkening sky outside. The storm was building visibly now. The cloud ceiling had dropped through the night, and by 0900 it was low enough that the ridgelines to the west had disappeared into it entirely. The air smelled like rain, even though none had fallen yet. At 1100, Hale ran the class through a final review of the afternoon standard evaluation scenario from Foxtrot. He covered the parameters clearly and without drama. 900 yards, spotter support, standard evaluation sheet, 3-shot group, minimum 2 of 3 within the scoring zone. He answered 2 questions from Yarbrough and 1 from Reeves about wind hold adjustments at distance in the projected conditions. He did not mention position Echo. He did not look at her in any way that separated her from the group. She ate lunch at 12:15 and tasted none of it. At 13:30, she went to the armory, signed out her rifle, and spent 30 minutes alone in the short-range bay at the rear of the armory building, running dry fire at a scaled target she'd set up at 25 yards to check her trigger mechanics. Not for accuracy at that range. It was a check, the same way you check a vehicle's tire pressure before a long drive. She wanted to know her trigger was where she'd left it, that her finger placement was consistent, that her breathing sequence was producing the correct physiological response. Everything was where it was supposed to be. She signed back into the armory, left the rifle in its rack for the moment, and walked to position Echo at 1400. An hour early. Nobody told her to come early, but nobody had told her not to, and she wanted the position. Echo was everything she remembered. The narrow slot in the ridgeline, the deteriorating sandbag revetment on the firing ledge, the wind already pushing through the notch with a quality that was different from the open range. Contained, deflected. The flags at the 200-yard mark, barely visible through her binoculars at this distance, were reading west-southwest at what she estimated as 20 to 25 sustained. But inside the slot, the air was doing something more complicated. It moved in pulses rather than a continuous stream, the ridgeline catching the main flow and breaking it into intervals that she felt on her face rather than read from any instrument. She sat in the slot for 40 minutes and did nothing but feel the wind. She felt it on her left cheek, where the south deflection was pushing it. She felt it against the back of her neck when a gust came through hard enough to find the gap between her collar and her helmet. She felt it on her hands, which she kept bare despite the cold, because she needed the sensitivity. She felt it in the way it moved the grass in the depression, 900 yards downrange. The same grass she'd been reading in her mind since Wednesday night, and she watched that grass with the kind of attention that had no impatience in it, the way her grandfather had looked at a draw in the Wyoming hills, like someone with nowhere else to be. The rain started at 1448, not heavy at first, a preliminary rain, the kind that comes ahead of the real thing, fat isolated drops that hit the hard pan and raised small puffs of dust before the ground was wet enough to stop doing that. Then, over about 8 minutes, it increased, steady now, with purpose. The drops smaller and more numerous, the sound on the ridgeline changing from random impacts to a continuous soft percussion. Her rifle was under a waterproof cover. She left it there for now. At 14:55, she heard boots on the access road below the ridgeline, and she looked back over her shoulder and saw Hale coming up the incline with Vane behind him, and behind Vane, a group of people she hadn't expected. Not just the assistant instructors, the entire class. All 9 remaining candidates, full kit, climbing the ridgeline access path toward Position Echo. Behind them, 2 more people she didn't recognize, both in uniform, both with ranks she couldn't read at this distance. She turned back to the range. Behind her, she heard them assembling. The scrape of boots on rock, the low sound of people finding positions, the controlled quiet of a group that had been told to observe and understood what that meant. She heard Hale's voice, low and directional, telling people where to stand. She heard Vane say something she couldn't make out. She heard Mora's voice, very briefly, say something to someone next to him that she also couldn't make out. She heard the response, which was a short, flat sound that might have been agreement or dismissal. She didn't turn around to look. Calloway appeared at her left, crouching into the slot beside her. "Hale sent me," he said quietly. "I'm not your spotter. I'm here to observe and log. Your call, your read, no input from me." "Understood. 940 yards to the target, steel plate 12-inch. Wind flag at 200 is reading west-southwest, about 25. Flag at 400 looks higher. Maybe 30, 32. I see it. Rain's picking up. I know." He settled into position beside her and went quiet. That was the right thing to do. She'd worked with Calloway long enough to know that when he went quiet, it wasn't discomfort. It was respect for process. She pulled the waterproof cover off her rifle. The rain hit the scope glass immediately. She had a scope cover that would protect it until the last second, which she'd leave on until she was ready to break the shot. She checked the action. Dry, protected, functioning. She settled into the firing position, found the natural point of aim on the target, and adjusted her body until the reticle sat on the steel plate with her muscles relaxed rather than driving the rifle toward it. Natural point of aim, fundamental and non-negotiable. The target was barely visible. The rain reduced visibility at distance in a way that wasn't dramatic but was real. The plate was a dark rectangle in a field of gray, softened by the falling water and the light that was already going flat under the cloud ceiling. She could see it. She could see it well enough. At 1500 exactly, she heard Hale's voice behind her. "Range is hot. Flag drops on my command. You have 60 seconds from flag drop. Do you copy, Captain?" "Copy, sir." A pause. Rain on rock. Rain on her back. Rain running off the brim of her helmet in a thin stream that she ignored. "Anything you need before we begin?" She thought about that for a second. "What's the flag reading at 400 exact?" She heard someone move. A pause. 31 knots. South component approximately 12 degrees off west, 12 degrees south. Slightly more than she'd estimated from the grass alone, but consistent with the deflection pattern she'd been feeling in the slot. She adjusted her mental calculation. The standard hold was going to understate the lateral push by the south component. She needed to account for it as a compound correction, not a simple windage adjustment. She worked the math in her head. Not formal ballistic math. She'd internalized the tables well enough that the numbers weren't really numbers anymore. They were spatial relationships, distances in 3 dimensions that she could feel as well as calculate. The bullet would take approximately 1.3 seconds to cover 940 yards at this muzzle velocity and altitude. In 1.3 seconds, a 31-knot wind with a 12-degree south component would push the round approximately, she let the number settle, 41 to 43 inches lateral, with a south walk of roughly 6 to 8 inches that would compound the standard holdover. She made her adjustment. 3.8 MOA right, 0.4 MOA, down to account for the south component and the slight elevation drop to the target. She clicked her turrets. "Ready," she said. A pause. A long pause. The rain got heavier, briefly, then settled back. Behind her, nobody made a sound. Then Hales said, "Flag drops." She pulled the scope cover. Rainwater hit the glass. She ignored it. The glass was coated, the image was clear enough, and the target was there. She put the reticle where she'd calculated. She breathed in. Halfway out. Hold. She watched the grass in the depression. In the rain, it was harder to read. The drops were flattening it, making the movement less clean, more turbulent. She waited for a moment when the grass gave her something she could work with, a brief window where the wind's behavior was legible rather than noise. 30 seconds gone. She knew without counting. The grass in the depression flattened, hard to the right, a gust pushing through. She didn't move. She held. Then the gust passed, and for maybe 3 seconds the grass lay at a lower angle. Still, almost, the steady wind without the gust's added energy, and that was the moment. That was exactly the moment, and she broke the shot. The rifle cracked. The suppressor took most of the impulse, rolling it into a lower, rounder sound that the rain absorbed almost immediately. For a moment, a long moment, longer than it should have been, long enough that she felt the first edge of doubt start to form at the back of her mind. There was nothing. Then the steel sang, not the crisp ring of a close shot. At this distance in this rain, it was a lower, flatter sound, slightly delayed, like a bell struck through water. But it was unmistakable. Steel on steel. Impact. Not a near miss on the berm, not a ricochet. The specific flat resonance of a centered hit on a 12-inch plate at 940 yards in 31-knot wind and falling rain. She stayed in position. Behind her, complete silence. Not the silence of people being politely quiet. The silence of people who had stopped breathing. She heard Calloway say, very quietly, almost to himself, "Holy!" He didn't finish it. She heard boots. She heard Hale walking forward, 2 steps, 3 steps, stopping somewhere close behind her left shoulder. She heard rain on his uniform, on the rock, on the ridgeline. She didn't turn around. "Stay in position," he said. His voice was different, not softer exactly, but something in the register had shifted. Some quality of predetermined judgment had gone out of it. "Don't move your rifle. Don't adjust your position." She kept her eye behind the scope. She heard him doing something. Movement, footsteps, equipment sounds she couldn't fully identify. Then she heard him walk back to where he'd been standing. Then his voice, flat and deliberate. "Load a second round." She heard the class react. Not loudly, more a collective shift in breathing, a subtle pressure change that she felt rather than heard. The sound of 9 people processing something unexpected simultaneously. Calloway beside her went absolutely still. She reached into her kit, pulled a single round from the loop on her chest rig, and loaded it with the smooth, unhurried movement of someone doing something they had done 10,000 times, which she had. She cycled the bolt. She brought the rifle back to her cheek. She heard Mora's voice from somewhere behind and to the right. He said, very low, to whoever was standing next to him, "First one was luck." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. She didn't react. Her breathing didn't change. Her position didn't change. The reticle sat exactly where she put it. She heard Hale's voice from directly behind her now. "Do it again." Not a question, not a request. A command, clean and unambiguous, with something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not challenge, not contempt, but the particular pressure of a man who needed to know something and had decided this was how he was going to find out. The rain was heavier now. Real rain. Not the preliminary version, the kind that came in sheets and reduced the target from a dark rectangle to a suggestion of a dark rectangle at the edge of visibility. Water was running down her scope glass in thin rivulets that she was reading as interference rather than obstruction. She could still see. Not perfectly. Enough. She checked the grass. The storm had flattened the depression entirely. The grass was down, uniform, driven by the sustained wind without the earlier gust cycles, which meant the condition was steadier now, paradoxically more readable in its consistency than it had been in the gusts. Steady was easier than variable. Variable made you wait. Steady let you calculate. She recalculated. The first shot had told her something the data alone couldn't. The actual flight path, the actual wind effect at this specific moment, on this specific range. She'd heard the ring, she knew it was centered, which meant her hold had been correct, which meant her read had been correct, which meant the only remaining variable was whether the conditions had changed in the last 90 seconds. She decided they hadn't changed enough to matter. She found her breathing. In. Halfway out. The reticle settled. She waited for one more second, not from doubt, but from the habit her grandfather had drilled into her until it was bone deep. The last thing before you pull is to check whether you actually see the target or whether you're seeing what you expect to see. They're different. The first is information. The second is assumption. She saw the target. She pulled. The crack. The weight. The rain. And then from 940 yards away, flat and definitive, through the falling water, the steel rang again. She heard someone behind her make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that comes out of people before language catches up. She heard Reeves say, barely above a whisper, "There it is." She heard Yarbrough exhale, long and slow, like a man who'd been holding it for the entire 90 seconds. She didn't move. She kept her eye on the target through the scope, the rain on the glass, the steel plate barely visible through the weather and still ringing, still ringing. Behind her, the silence lasted long enough that she could feel the weight of it on her back. Then she heard Hale take 2 steps forward until he was directly behind her, close enough that she could hear his breathing, rain-wet and slow. And she heard him stop. And she heard the sound of a man who had built an entire theory of a person over 9 weeks and was now standing in the rain with the evidence that the theory was wrong. And she heard what it cost him to say the next thing he said. "Stand up, Captain." She safed the rifle. She pulled her eye from the scope. She stood. The rain hit her face, and she let it. She turned around. Hale was looking at her. The entire class was looking at her. 9 candidates and 2 unknown officers in Vane and Mora, all of them standing on the ridgeline in the rain, and none of them were doing anything except looking. Mora was very still. His green notebook was in his hand, and he wasn't writing in it. Hale's expression was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the controlled neutrality of a man maintaining professional distance. What was there instead was something more complicated, a kind of recognition that looked almost physical, like something landing. He didn't smile. That wasn't who he was. But he looked at her and he said, quietly enough that only the people close could hear, "I've run 93 candidates through this course. In 11 years. He paused. "Nobody has ever done that." The rain fell between them. She held his gaze because that was what you did. "That shot," Mora said, from somewhere behind Hale's shoulder, his voice carrying a quality she'd never heard in it before, a defensive tightness, like a man trying to rebuild something even as he felt it give way. In these conditions. "Mora," Hale said, not loud, just flat and final. And it stopped whatever was coming next the way a wall stops water. Mora went quiet. Hale looked at her for another moment. The rain ran off his cover and fell in a straight line from the brim. Then he said, "Rest the rifle. Don't leave this position. I need to make a call." He turned and walked back along the ridgeline toward the range office, his boots loud on the wet rock, Vane falling into step beside him without being asked, the two of them moving with the particular purpose of men going somewhere important. She stood in the rain and let the rifle rest. Calloway appeared at her shoulder, close but not intrusive, the way he always managed to be. "What do you think the call is?" he said quietly. She looked downrange, where the steel plate was still there, catching rain. 2 hits centered on its face that she could see faintly as small, bright abrasions in the rust and weather of the metal. "I don't know," she said. And she didn't. She genuinely didn't. What she knew was that the shot had been real, both of them, and that nobody on this ridgeline could take that back. Not Mora and his notebook, and not the 9 weeks of accumulated doubt, and not the weight of every bet that had been placed on her failure. The rain came down. She stood in it, and somewhere down the access road, Colonel Marcus Hale was on a phone, talking to someone whose name she didn't know yet, about something she hadn't been told yet. And whatever it was, she understood with a clarity that came from somewhere beyond analysis that the course had just changed into something none of them, herself included, had been fully prepared for. Hale was gone for 22 minutes. She knew because she counted. Not obsessively. She wasn't watching a clock, didn't have one in her eyeline. But the way you count things when standing still in the rain with nothing to do gives the mind a problem to solve, and the mind takes it. She counted her breathing cycles and converted. 22 minutes, roughly, give or take. The class had dispersed slightly on the ridgeline in the way groups do when the focal event ends and nobody gives them new instructions. Some sat on the rock. Reeves was standing at the edge of the position looking down range, hands in his jacket pockets, with the expression of a man processing something privately. Yarborough and Decker had moved together and were talking in low voices she couldn't hear. Mora was standing slightly apart from everyone else, the green notebook in his hand, not open, not closed, just held. Calloway had stayed at her shoulder the whole time, which she noticed and appreciated without commenting on. The two unknown officers, she'd gotten a better look at them coming up the ridgeline, both lieutenant colonels, one of them wearing a tab combination she recognized as Special Forces qualified, were standing to the right of the firing slot talking to each other without looking at the class. They had the conversation body language of people continuing a discussion that had started somewhere else. The rain was steady and cold and settling into the kind of sustained fall that meant it would be here for hours. Her uniform was soaked through the jacket at the shoulders. She could feel the water in her boots. She stood in it and waited and didn't move the rifle. Hale came back up the ridgeline at a pace that was slightly faster than his normal walk, which she clocked immediately. Vane was still with him, and there was someone on the phone behind them. One of the unknown lieutenant colonels, now speaking into a handset with the directional focus of someone taking notes from the other end. The SF tabbed one. He wasn't writing anything down, just listening, his face unreadable. Hale came through this group without stopping and came directly to the firing slot. He looked at her. Then he looked at the rifle. Then he looked downrange toward the target. "Both rounds on steel," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd already confirmed it through binoculars before he came back. "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who'd made a decision but hadn't yet committed to saying it out loud, which was its own kind of tell. "I want a full debrief, not the standard form. A complete walkthrough of both shots. Your read, your calculation, your decision point, everything." He paused. "Tonight, 1900 hours. Bring your personal log if you've been keeping one." She looked at him. "How do you know I've been keeping one?" Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. "Because you're the kind of shooter who keeps one. And because Calloway mentioned it 3 weeks ago without realizing it mattered." She didn't look at Calloway. She heard him, next to her, make the quiet sound of a man absorbing a mistake he couldn't undo. 1900, sir," she said. "Cleared from the range. Get dry." She picked up the rifle. The debrief was not in Hale's office. It was in the Range Operations Building, in the larger conference room at the back, that she'd only been in once before, during a Week 3 course overview. The room had a whiteboard wall, a long table with 8 chairs, and a video projection system that hadn't been used since she'd arrived. Tonight, it was in use. The SF-tabbed lieutenant colonel, whose name she learned when he introduced himself with a handshake and no particular ceremony, was Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Greer, had a laptop open and a satellite map of Black Ridge up on the projection screen, with position echo marked and the target location geotagged with coordinates. Vane was there. Hale was there. Greer was there, and the other unknown lieutenant colonel, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Okafor, who had the compact attentiveness of someone who listened as a professional skill. There was a recording device on the table, an Army-issue digital recorder, and Okafor confirmed it was running before anyone sat down. "This is a formal debrief," Hale said. "Recorded. It will be incorporated into your evaluation record." He looked at her across the table. "And into something else, which we'll get to." She put her personal logbook on the table. Hale looked at it. He reached across and she let him take it. He opened it to a random page. She could see from the angle it was from week 5, her observations from the observation platform on the North Ridge line, and he read for about 30 seconds before he set it down. "Tell me about the first shot," Greer said. He had a direct manner, no preamble, the kind of voice that was used to asking questions that needed accurate answers. She walked them through it. The 40 minutes in the slot before the evaluation started. The wind in the slot versus the flags at 200 and 400 yards. The south deflection component from the northern ridge line. The way the rain changed the grass behavior in the depression. The 3-second window she'd identified in the gust cycle. The compound correction. 3.8 MOA right, 0.4 MOA down. And the reasoning behind it. Greer stopped her twice to ask clarifying questions. Both times the questions were technical, precise, and indicated familiarity with long-range ballistics at a level beyond instructional. "You identified the south deflection component before the evaluation," Okafor said. "You mentioned arriving an hour early." "Yes, ma'am." "The evaluation protocol doesn't allow early access to the firing position on evaluation day." "There's no restriction on access to the ridgeline, ma'am. Position echo is in the general access area. I wasn't on the firing ledge, I was on the ridgeline above it." Okafor made a note. "That's a meaningful distinction." "I thought so, ma'am." Vane, who had been listening without speaking, said, "The second shot. Take us through the decision." She described it. The way the sustained rain had paradoxically simplified the wind, read by eliminating the gust cycle. The information she'd extracted from the first shot's confirmed hit. Validation that her hold calculation was accurate for the actual in-flight conditions rather than the predicted ones. The decision to maintain the same hold because the conditions hadn't shifted enough to justify a change. "You decided the conditions were stable enough to repeat," Vane said. "I decided the variation was within my margin, sir. Not stable. Inside margin." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "Stable means it won't change. Inside margin means it might change but not enough to matter. I don't assume conditions are stable. I assess whether the change I'm anticipating is larger or smaller than my acceptable variance." She paused. In this case, the rain was increasing slightly, which would reduce velocity marginally and push the point of impact down maybe half an inch at that distance, within margin. Greer leaned forward. "You calculated that in real time, while the clock was running." "The clock was already past halfway. There wasn't a lot of time for extended calculation." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "Yes, sir. In real time." He sat back. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the rain was still coming down, straight and heavy now, drumming on the metal roof of the range operations building in a way that made everything in the room feel more enclosed. "Captain Cross," Okafor said, "I want to ask you about your service record." Something in the room's quality shifted, not dramatically. Nobody moved. Nobody changed expression. But she felt it. "Ma'am, you've had 2 combat deployments. First deployment, 3rd Infantry Division, conventional infantry support. Second deployment," she looked at the file in front of her. "Second deployment is listed as advisory role with a joint task force, theater not specified on the standard record." "That's accurate, ma'am." "The theater not specified portion." "Yes, ma'am." "Colonel Greer's office requested your full service jacket 6 days ago," Okafor said. "Not the standard personnel file. The complete jacket, including classified annexes." Evelyn said nothing. "The theater was specified in the classified annex," Okafor continued, "as were 14 confirmed long-range engagements during the advisory deployment, ranging from 400 to over 1,100 yards. She closed the file. The longest of which, at 1,112 yards, was taken under conditions your after-action report describes as, and I'm paraphrasing, quote, "degraded visibility, sustained 28-knot wind with irregular gusts, no spotter, target acquisition window of approximately 45 seconds." The recording device hummed softly on the table. "Would you say today's evaluation reproduced those conditions?" Okafor said. She considered the question carefully. Today was shorter distance. Conditions were roughly comparable, maybe slightly worse visibility. She paused. The 1,100-yard shot was harder. Greer made a sound, not a laugh, more the involuntary exhale of someone who'd been holding something for a while. Hale was looking at her with an expression she finally had a name for. Not anger, not professional assessment. Something closer to the look of a man who'd been wrong in a very specific way and was deciding what to do with that information. "Why wasn't that record more visible in your standard personnel file?" he said. His voice was level. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. "I don't manage my own personnel files, sir." "But you knew what was in the classified annex." "I knew what I did on deployment, sir." "Did you know the annex existed?" She took a breath. "I knew the after-action reports went somewhere." Hale looked at her for a long moment. "When you applied to this course, 3 times, you knew you had a combat record that would have supported the application more strongly than what was in your standard file." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you disclose it?" She held his gaze. "Because I wanted to qualify on the basis of what I could do here, not on the basis of what I'd done somewhere else." Silence. Greer said quietly, "That's either very principled or very stupid." "I'm aware of the ambiguity, sir." Vane said, "Your first 2 applications were rejected. Did you consider at any point that disclosing the classified record might have accelerated the process?" "Yes, sir." "And you still didn't?" "No, sir." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because if the record is what gets me in, then the record is what I'm standing on. And the record isn't here with me. I am." She paused. "I wanted to find out if that was enough." The room was quiet again, the rain on the roof. Okafor closed her notebook. "Colonel Hale, do you want to address the modification to the evaluation scenario?" Hale shifted in his chair. He was a man who did not shift easily, which meant it cost him something. "The modification was within my authority as course commander." "I'm not questioning your authority," Okafor said, with the particular gentleness of someone who was, precisely, questioning his authority. "I'm asking whether you want to address it." He looked at the table. Then he looked at Evelyn. "The modification was intended to produce conditions under which a marginal candidate would fail and a qualified candidate would either succeed or demonstrate the specific nature of their deficiency. It was not—" He stopped. Started again. "The distance and conditions I selected were at the outer boundary of what I believed was achievable under evaluation parameters." "And," Vane said, "and I was wrong about the outer boundary," Hale said. The words came out flat and undecorated, and she understood that for him, that sentence was as close to an apology as the architecture of the man allowed. Greer looked at her. "Captain, I'm going to tell you why Okafor and I are here, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer." "Sir, we're attached to a force generation working group that's been tasked with evaluating qualification standards for a specialized long-range direct action capability that currently doesn't exist in the Army's formal force structure. It's been informally requested by 3 different theater commanders in the last 18 months, and the working group was stood up 4 months ago." He looked at his laptop, then back at her. "We've been reviewing qualification records from LRPF courses across the last 3 years. Colonel Vane flagged your observation report. Your classified service jacket was requested as a result." He paused. "The question I'm going to ask you is whether you'd be interested in a conversation about what comes after this course ends." She looked at him, at Okafor, at Vane, at Hale, who was looking at the table. "I'm going to finish this course first," she said. Greer blinked. Then he nodded once, slowly. "Fair enough." Get. She slept better that night. Not well. The rain was still going and her mind wasn't fully quiet. But better. And when the 0530 alarm pulled her up, she felt something closer to level than she had in the previous 48 hours. The debrief's content spread through the class the way information always spread in a contained environment, incompletely and unevenly, with distortion accumulating at each transmission point. She didn't know exactly what Calloway had overheard or what had been visible to the class on the ridgeline, and she made no effort to manage the narrative. What she knew was that by morning chow, the way people oriented to her in the chow hall was different, not uniformly. Mora was still eating at the far end of the table, still with his notebook nearby, still with the body language of a man who was rebuilding an argument, but the ambient texture had changed. Reeves held the chow hall door for her. That was new. Yarbrough asked, during the morning instruction block, if she'd eaten at the south table before she answered a ballistics question, and Decker, beside him, had looked over with actual attention rather than the polite inattention he'd been giving her for 7 weeks. These were small things, but small things were the unit of currency in closed environments. Mora confronted her at 10:15 in the corridor outside the armory. She'd been expecting it. Not that specific moment, the timing was his choice, but the confrontation itself had been a certainty since the rain on the ridgeline. She'd watched it building in him across 2 days, the progressive tightening of a man whose position was eroding and who was deciding whether to defend it or abandon it. He chose to defend it. "I want to talk to you," he said. She stopped. "All right." He had the notebook. He was holding it with both hands, which she noted. "That shot yesterday," he said. "Both shots. I want you to know that I documented every training session this course, including the documented miss on day 58, she said. 700 yards, first round miss, second round hit. It's in my evaluation record." He blinked. He hadn't expected her to say it first. "That's right, and there are other inconsistencies." "What inconsistencies specifically?" He stopped. "Your performance has been inconsistent under certain conditions. High stress, observed scenarios, you've shown a pattern of—" "Mora." She kept her voice level. "What's in the notebook?" He looked at her. He looked at the notebook. Something in his posture shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. "It's a running log," he said. "Performance observations. That's standard. Is it in the official evaluation system?" "Not all of it." "Which parts aren't in the official system?" He was quiet. "Mora." "Which parts aren't in the official evaluation system?" "Contextual observations," he said. "Things that don't fit the formal rubric." "What does that mean?" He looked at her, and for the first time in 9 weeks, she saw something in his face that wasn't certainty. He was a man who'd built a structure and was standing in front of it watching it develop cracks, and didn't yet know how serious they were. "I was doing my job," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking what your job actually was with that notebook." He didn't answer. "If it's official, it should be in the system," she said. "If it's not in the system, it's personal. And if it's personal, I'd like to know whose interest it serves." She looked at him. Not with anger, she was past anger, had been past it for weeks. "I'm not trying to create a problem for you, but I'm also done pretending I don't see what you're doing." He held the notebook with both hands for another moment. Then he said, "The first shot could have been luck." She looked at him. "The second shot wasn't." He didn't have an answer for that. She'd known he wouldn't because there wasn't one. She walked past him toward the armory. She heard behind her the sound of him standing in the corridor for a long time before he moved. The formal confrontation came 2 days later and arrived from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Hale called her in at 1400 on Saturday, not into his office, into the range operations conference room again, which had become the room where things happened that required official witnesses. Vane was there. Greer and Okafor had left the installation Friday morning, but there was a new face at the table, a full colonel named Declan Marsh from the LRPF course's parent training brigade, who had driven out from his office 4 hours away and whose expression suggested he'd made that drive specifically and deliberately, and not because he'd been passing through. There was a second folder on the table beside Marsh, thicker than the one Okafor had brought. "Sit down, Captain," Hale said. She sat. Marsh looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who'd formed an opinion at a distance and was now checking it against the source material. "I've reviewed the evaluation modification Colonel Hale applied to your Week 9 scenario," he said. "I've also reviewed the debrief transcript from Thursday evening and Colonel Vane's independent assessment." He put his hand on the folder. "And I've reviewed a complaint that was filed yesterday afternoon." She kept her face neutral. "A complaint filed by whom, sir?" "Sergeant First Class Mora. Against you." She said nothing. "Specifically," Marsh continued, "Mora alleges that you used your position as a candidate with apparent command attention to intimidate a subordinate instructor and imply that his professional documentation activities constituted misconduct." The room was quiet. "He used the word intimidate," she said. "He did." "What did I say to him, sir? Specifically according to the complaint." Marsh looked at the folder. He read from it. The content of her corridor conversation with Mora, mostly accurately rendered, with one addition. Mora had characterized her final question, "I'd like to know whose interest it serves," as a threat regarding potential formal reporting of his activities. Is that characterization accurate? Marsh said. No, sir. What was your intent? To understand what he was documenting and why. Specifically, whether the documentation was official or personal. Why did that matter to you? Because an instructor maintaining a personal performance log on a specific candidate outside the formal evaluation system is either supplemental documentation authorized by the course commander or it's something else. I had no information indicating Colonel Hale had authorized personal documentation by his assistant instructors. I asked Mora which it was. She paused. He didn't answer. Hale said, I didn't authorize personal documentation. The room registered that. Marsh looked at Hale. You weren't aware of the notebook? Not until Thursday's debrief referenced it. And now that you are aware, Hale looked at the table. I've asked Mora to submit the notebook for review. He submitted it this morning. And? The documentation is extensive, beyond the scope of standard instructor observation notes. He paused. It also includes observations about other candidates, not only Captain Cross. That was information she hadn't had. She kept her reaction off her face. Marsh sat with that for a moment. He looked at the folder, then at Evelyn, with the expression of a man doing a calculation whose variables kept changing. Captain Cross, he said, do you have any record of your interactions with Sergeant Mora that would contradict his characterization of your conversation? No documentary record, sir. It was a corridor conversation. Any witnesses? Not that I'm aware of. So it's his account against yours? Effectively, sir. Yes. Marsh looked at Hale. Something passed between them. Not a look of collusion, more the look of two senior officers assessing the same problem from slightly different angles and arriving at the same conclusion about its weight. I'm going to tell you how I see this, Marsh said. An assistant instructor maintained an unofficial performance log on multiple candidates in a course where at least one candidate was already navigating documented preferential treatment in evaluation assignments. That log was used, at minimum, to inform a formal complaint against that same candidate after she performed in a way that undermined the basis for the preferential treatment. He closed the folder. Does that summary seem accurate to you, Captain? What? It seems accurate, sir. Do you want to file a counter-complaint? She thought about it. No, sir. He looked at her. Why not? Because Mora's complaint is going to resolve itself on the existing facts. A counter-complaint turns it into a bilateral dispute, which makes it messier and longer. The existing facts are sufficient. Marsh looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't name, but that felt like respect in a form that hadn't decided to announce itself yet. The existing facts, he said, include a modification to your evaluation scenario that exceeded standard course parameters, documented in your official record, which produced a result that I'm going to describe as historically notable. He looked at Hale. Colonel. Hale looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the rain on the ridgeline, with the particular quality of a man who'd done something and was accounting for it. The scenario modification was my call, he said. It was within my authority. It was also, in some respects, he stopped. The room waited. He didn't look away from her. It wasn't only about assessment. I want to be honest about that. The silence had weight. I had a theory about this class, he said, about what was needed to prove performance under genuine pressure, and I had a separate theory about specific candidates. He paused. One of those theories was correct. One was not. She looked at him. Which was which, sir? The pressure theory was correct, he said. The other one wasn't. She nodded. He nodded back. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was something more than acknowledgement and less than absolution. And it was, she thought, the most honest thing he was capable of in this room, in front of these people. And she decided it was enough. Marsh stood, which ended the formal portion of the meeting. Captain Cross. The final qualification sequence runs in 4 days. Regardless of everything that's happened this week, you run it under standard parameters with the rest of the class. No modifications, no special scenarios. He looked at her. Is that understood? Yes, sir. And for the record, whatever Colonel Greer discussed with you Thursday night, that conversation is separate from this course, separate from this complaint, and separate from your qualification standing. Is that also understood? Yes, sir. Good. He picked up the folder. Get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in a week. She almost said she'd slept fine last night. She let it go. Awesome. The 4 days before the final qualification had a different texture than anything that had come before. Mora was removed from active instruction duties pending the notebook review. He didn't leave the installation. He was still there, still present at formations, still eating in the chow hall. But he wasn't on the range and he wasn't in the briefing room, and his absence from those spaces changed the air in them. Whether the change was relief or discomfort depended on who you asked. Calloway thought it was mostly relief. Reeves, characteristically, thought it was complicated. He wasn't wrong about everything, Reeves said. They were cleaning weapons in the bay on the evening before the final qualification. The familiar smell of solvent and oil, the particular piece of maintenance work that doesn't require thought. Some of his observations about candidates were accurate. Decker does break position under sustained pressure. Yarbrough's wind reading above 800 yards is inconsistent. Accurate observations and an unauthorized log being used for unauthorized purposes, she said. Sure, but accurate. He ran a patch through his barrel and held it up to the light. I'm just saying that the notebook being wrong in one way doesn't make it wrong in every way. No, she agreed. It doesn't. What do you think happens to him? Formal counseling, probably. Possible reassignment. She checked her bolt face. Depends on what's in the notebook about the other candidates. He really documented everyone. That's what Hale said. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Why would he do that? I don't know. People document things for different reasons. She thought about it. Sometimes it's control. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's just... She paused. Sometimes people build a record because they're afraid of what happens if there isn't one. Reeves looked at her. That's a generous reading. Maybe. She set down the bolt and started reassembling. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm trying to understand it. Those are different things. He watched her assemble the rifle with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done it in the dark. You know, he said after a moment, when you first got in the van, day 1, I was one of the 8. She looked at him. The bet, he said. I put $50 on you washing out by week 4. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the rifle. I know. You knew? Calloway told me the pool was $800. There were 8 of you. $50 each would be about right. He was quiet. I lost $50. You did. Worth it, he said, and went back to his barrel patch, and that was that. The night before the final qualification, she sat outside on the steps behind the barracks for 40 minutes in air that had gone cold and clear after the week's rain, the stars back in full force across the desert sky. Her logbook was on her knee, but she wasn't writing in it. She was looking at the ridgeline to the west where Position Echo sat invisible in the dark. She thought about her grandfather. Not the way she usually thought about him. Not the technique, not the wind lessons, not the Wyoming hillsides. Just the man himself. The way he'd looked at her on that February morning in the hospital, with that complete and unrattled attention, like she was the only variable in the room that needed accounting for. She thought about what he'd know about this week if he could see it. She thought he'd probably say something quiet and deflating and precisely accurate, the way he always had when she was in danger of taking herself too seriously. She thought about Greer's question and what came after. She thought about 10 shots in the morning. She closed the logbook and looked at the stars for another 10 minutes without thinking about anything in particular, which was harder than most skills she'd developed and more valuable than almost any of them. Then she went inside and slept, and for once, the sleep came without negotiation. Somewhere across the installation, in the range operations building, a light was still on. She didn't know whose it was. She decided it didn't matter. Tomorrow had its own requirements, and she had done everything she could do today, and the rest was in the morning. The light in the range operations building was still on when she woke at 0400. She could see it from her bunk through the small rectangular window. A single yellow rectangle across the dark installation, steady and unchanged from when she'd gone inside 4 hours ago. She lay still for a moment watching it, then decided it wasn't her problem, turned onto her back, and waited for the alarm. It came at 0500. She was already sitting up. The qualification day had the particular quality of days that have been anticipated so long, they arrive feeling slightly unreal, like a photograph of a place you've only seen in other photographs. The sky was clear, the storm weak a memory, the air washed clean and cold and very still in the pre-dawn dark. By the time PT formation assembled at 0530, the stars were still visible overhead, and the temperature was 38 degrees, and everyone's breath came out white and was immediately gone. They ran 4 kilometers instead of 6, which was the course's traditional accommodation on qualification day, enough to wake the body without burning energy the afternoon would need. She ran it at a pace slightly slower than her usual, deliberate, keeping her breathing in a range that wouldn't spike her heart rate above 140. Her shoulder had loosened over the past week and was down to a dull, manageable ache that she'd stopped thinking about. Her boots were dry for the first time in 4 days. After PT, after showers, after chow that she ate more of than she'd expected to want, there was a 2-hour window before the qualification sequence began that the course structure left open. No instruction, no range work, just time. The theory was rest and mental preparation. The reality was that 9 people handled 2 unstructured hours in 9 different ways, and the range building and the barracks and the area behind the motor pool all had small clusters of candidates doing whatever their particular version of pre-qualification ritual looked like. Evelyn went back to the barracks, sat on her bunk, and cleaned her rifle for the 3rd time in 12 hours. Not because it needed it, because the process had its own calming logic. The systematic progression from chamber to muzzle, each part examined and cleared and confirmed. Nothing left to assumption. When she was done, she did it again, slower. Calloway watched her from his bunk without comment for a while. Then he said, "You know that rifle is clean." "Yep." "You cleaned it last night." "Yep." He was quiet for a moment. "You nervous?" She thought about it honestly. Something like nervous, different from nervous. "What's it feel like?" "Like knowing something is going to happen and not knowing exactly what shape it takes when it arrives." He considered that. "I think that's just nervous." "Maybe," she said, and started on the bolt assembly. He went back to reading whatever he'd been reading. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of her work, and the distant sound of someone doing something with weights in the PT area, and the very ordinary sounds of a morning on an installation that was, for this specific day, carrying more weight than usual. At 900, she put the rifle down. She picked up her grandfather's logbook. Not her own log, a different one she'd brought from home and hadn't opened during the course. His logbook. The one he'd kept across 40 years of shooting in his cramped, left-leaning handwriting, with observations about wind and terrain and shot selection that read like field notes from a very specific and lifelong conversation with the world. She opened it to no particular page and read for 45 minutes, not looking for anything, just reading. The way you listen to someone you trust without needing to extract information from what they're saying. She closed it at 0947 and put it back in her kit. "Okay," she said. Calloway looked up. "Okay." "Let's go," she said. The qualification range was position foxtrot for the standard 900-yard sequence, and by 1,000 hours it had the organized, controlled energy of a significant event. Range safety personnel at intervals along the access road, evaluation sheets prepared, the target array set and confirmed by the range OIC, a small group of observers from the brigade staff who'd driven out this morning in 2 vehicles that were still parked at the range gate. Colonel Marsh was back. Vane was there. Hale was at the primary evaluation position with his clipboard and the flat, containing expression of someone who'd decided to let the morning speak for itself. The qualification sequence was straightforward in structure and not straightforward in execution. Each candidate would engage a 10-target array at 900 yards, a staggered presentation of steel plates that ran across the full width of the range berm, requiring the shooter to shift position between targets without fully breaking their firing platform. Minimum qualification was 7 of 10 within the scoring ring. Full qualification was 10 of 10. The time window for the full array was 12 minutes, which was enough time to be methodical and not enough time to be hesitant. She was slated 5th in the rotation. She watched the first 4 candidates run through their sequences from the observation position behind the firing line, noting things with the particular attention that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with information. The wind was light this morning, 6 to 8 knots, west-southwest, nothing like the week 9 storm. The mirage above the desert floor was minimal. Conditions that were, in the context of Black Ridge, almost forgiving. First candidate, Reeves. 8 of 10, one miss on the 7th target that clipped the scoring ring and didn't register. One clean miss on the 9th that he compensated for by rushing and didn't correct. Solid qualification. Not perfect. Real. Second candidate, Yarbrough. 7 of 10. His wind reading above 800 yards was still inconsistent, as Mora had noted and Reeves had acknowledged, and it showed on the far targets. He made qualification, and his expression afterward was the expression of a man who'd done exactly what he needed to do and was aware it wasn't more than that. Third candidate, Decker. 9 of 10, a near-perfect run that drew a quiet ripple through the observers that wasn't quite sound. He broke position on the 8th target, exactly the pressure response Mora had documented, and the miss came from it, but he recovered cleanly and finished the last 2 shots with a precision that suggested the break was a crack, not a collapse. Fourth candidate, a staff sergeant named Billings who'd been largely invisible in the course, consistent, unspectacular, never the best and never the worst. He shot 8 of 10 with a composure that suggested 8 of 10 was exactly what he'd calibrated for, no more and no less, and that calibration was its own kind of intelligence. Her name was called. She stood up from the observation bench, picked up her rifle, and walked to the firing position. The sun was high enough now to have real heat in it, and the desert floor shimmered faintly with the beginnings of the morning mirage. She could smell the warmed earth and the trace of brass and propellant from the previous 4-shooter sessions, and underneath all of it the particular dry mineral smell of the Nevada high desert that she'd been breathing for 12 weeks and had become as unremarkable as her own breath. She settled into the firing position, adjusted her body until the natural point of aim was comfortable. Took 2 minutes to read the range, the flags at 200 yards, the grass in the depression at 600, the mirage pattern above the berm, the quality of the air on her left cheek. The wind was what she'd clocked from observation, 6 to 8 sustained, no meaningful gust cycle, no significant south component today. Simpler than anything she'd shot in the last 3 weeks. She found the first target through the scope. She heard Hale's voice behind her. Range is hot. Commence when ready. She breathed in. Halfway out. She broke the shot. The steel rang. She shifted to the second target without looking up from the scope, the transition smooth and unhurried, letting the body do what the body had been doing for 12 weeks and 43 years of accumulated preparation that ran through her grandfather like a cable through rock. Second target. She fired. Steel. Third. She was breathing between shots with the rhythm of someone who'd stopped thinking about breathing. Automatic. The way driving becomes automatic. Not absent exactly, but running below the level of decision. Third target rang. Fourth. She identified a slight mirage distortion on this one. The target was positioned behind a zone of thermal shimmer that was making it appear to shift left by about half an inch at this magnification. She held right of center to account for it. Steel. Fifth. Sixth. The rhythm now was purely physical, the mind not so much absent as relegated. Still there, still monitoring, but not driving. The body was driving. The preparation was driving. She was just the last point in a very long line of cause and effect that had begun on a Wyoming hillside when she was 9 years old. Seventh, eighth. On the 9th target, she felt it. Not hesitation, not fear. Something more subtle. The awareness of how close she was, of what 10 for 10 would mean, of the observers behind her and the evaluation sheet on Hale's clipboard, and all of it, every bit of it, leaning in. And the awareness of all that leaning was itself a kind of pressure that wanted to change the quality of what she was doing. She recognized it. Her grandfather had told her about it. The moment when the shot stops being a shot and starts being a performance, when you stop shooting and start trying to prove. She held. Not the trigger. The internal thing. The place she came from before the noise started. She watched the 9th target for exactly 3 seconds. Then she broke the shot from that place, that quiet internal coordinate, and the steel rang the way it had rung on the ridgeline in the rain. Flat and definitive and absolutely final. 10th target. She shifted. Found it. The farthest target in the array, positioned at the full 900 yards at the right edge of the berm, partially in shadow from the ridgeline above. The shadow had a minor effect on perceived contrast. She made an automatic adjustment for it. She fired. The steel rang. She kept her eye on the scope. She heard the range go completely quiet. The particular quality of silence that had become familiar over the past week. The silence of people who had stopped generating sound because the event had exceeded whatever they were going to say about it. She heard Calloway say something under his breath that she couldn't make out. She heard Reeves say, very clearly, 10. She heard Hale write something on the clipboard. She stayed in position until he said, cease fire, safe your weapon. She cleared the rifle. She raised her head from the scope for the first time in 12 minutes, and the world came back in full. The sun on the hardpan, the smell of the range, the people behind her, the blue sky overhead with a single high cloud tracking east. She stood up. She turned around. Hale was looking at the clipboard, then at her, then back at the clipboard, with the expression of a man who had run 93 candidates through this course over 11 years and was doing arithmetic he hadn't previously needed to do. 10 for 10, he said. Not to the class, not to the observers, just as a statement of fact delivered to the air between them. She nodded once. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do once in 12 weeks. He looked away first. He turned to the class. Candidates, he said, what you've observed this morning across all 5 shooters so far is the range of outcomes this course is designed to produce. Some of you will recall that at the beginning of week 1 I said the only currency on this installation was performance under impossible conditions. He paused. I want to revise that slightly. He looked back at her briefly. The currency is preparation under impossible conditions. Performance is the result. He was quiet for a moment. Continue the rotation, he said, and walked toward the range office. She stepped back from the firing line and Calloway was there immediately, not saying anything, just standing beside her with the rifle case, the way a good partner stands when they understand that presence is more useful than words. She let him take the case. She stood in the sun with her hands at her sides and breathed the desert air and let the morning be what it was. The formal outcome meeting happened at 1400 in the Range Operations Conference Room with all 9 completing candidates present. Marsh ran it. Hale sat to his left. Vane was present along the wall. The evaluation sheets were on the table. Marsh went through each candidate's qualification result without commentary beyond the numerical score. Reeves, 8 of 10, qualified. Yarbrough, 7 of 10, qualified. Decker, 9 of 10, qualified. Billings, 8 of 10, qualified. Then 3 more candidates who'd completed the rotation after her. 2 qualified. One who shot 5 of 10 and whose face had the closed internal look of a man doing private accounting that was going to take a while. When Marsh reached her name, he said, Cross Evelyn, Captain, 10 of 10, first perfect score in the history of this course. The room registered it in the way rooms register things they already knew but hadn't yet heard confirmed. A shift in pressure, a collective exhale, something releasing. Nobody cheered. These were soldiers, but the silence had warmth in it. Qualification is confirmed for all 8 remaining candidates, Marsh said. Your certificates will be processed within 72 hours and forwarded to your unit records. He folded the sheet. Before we conclude, Colonel Hale has a statement. Hale stood. He had the look of a man who'd written something and decided not to read from it, who was going to say the thing directly or not at all. He looked at the class. This course runs on the principle that pressure reveals character. I've believed that for 11 years, and I still believe it. He paused. What I understand better now than I did 12 weeks ago is that character can be present without being visible, and that the failure to see it is a failure of the observer, not of the person being observed. He looked at Evelyn, directly, in front of the class and the observers and the recording system on the table. I made assessments in the first weeks of this course that were shaped by assumptions rather than evidence. Some of those assumptions drove evaluation modifications that were within my authority, but not always within reasonable practice. He stopped. I'm noting that on record, and I'm noting that the candidate who received those modifications outperformed every expectation I carried into this class, including the ones I wasn't aware I had. The room was still. That's all, he said, and sat down. She didn't look away from him. He'd looked away first on the range, and he didn't do it again now. He held her gaze, and in it there was something that had cost him, and she respected the cost. She nodded once. He nodded back. Outside, in the afternoon sun, the class broke into the informal, dissolving energy of people whose shared ordeal has ended and who are beginning the process of reassembling individual lives. Handshakes. Brief exchanges. The specific warmth of people who've been compressed together by circumstance and know the compression is ending. Reeves found her near the flagpole. "So," he said. "So. You know everyone's going to be talking about the Week 9 shots for a while." "Probably. You care?" She thought about it. "Not really." He studied her. "That's either healthy or weird." "Probably both," she said. He stuck his hand out. She shook it. His grip was what she'd expected. Firm, direct, no performance. $50, he said. "I still owe you $50, technically." "Keep it," she said. "For what?" "Calling out hail to my face, back in week 6. That wasn't nothing." He looked at her. "I didn't do anything. You told me what people were saying instead of letting me find out the hard way. That's something." She let his hand go. "Keep the money. Buy yourself better wind reading practice at 700 plus. He laughed. A short, surprise sound, the kind that comes out when someone says the accurate thing at the unexpected moment. He shook his head and walked away. Decker stopped her near the barracks entrance with his particular economy of movement, as if even stopping to talk was something he'd calculated the necessity of. "Good shooting," he said. "You too," she said. 9 out of 10 after a position break is solid. He looked at her. "You saw the break." "From observation. It was one step too far right on the reset." He thought about that. "Feels like left to me." "It looks like right from behind." He nodded slowly. "I'll work it." "I know you will," she said. He went inside. Yarbrough was last. He waited until the others had dispersed, which she suspected was intentional, and he came to her near the equipment shed where she was breaking down her kit for transport. He was carrying something, a small object she didn't immediately identify. He held it out. A pocket knife, older, bone handle, the kind of thing that had belonged to someone before him. "My grandfather's," he said. "He carried it for 30 years in the field. Said it was good luck." He paused. "I don't believe in luck, but I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you'd probably think that was silly." She looked at the knife. She looked at him. "I don't think it's silly," she said. "Keep it," he said. "Or don't. I just—" He exhaled. 10 for 10. "I wanted to give you something, and I didn't know what. And that's what I had." She took it, turned it over once. The bone handle was worn smooth in the places where a hand had held it a long time. "Thank you," she said. She put it in her jacket pocket. He nodded. He didn't have anything else to say, which was all right, because it was enough. Greer called at 17:30 on her personal cell phone, which meant he'd gotten the number from somewhere official. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you, sir." 10 for 10. "Yes, sir." Hale's statement at the outcome meeting. "I was there," she said. "That statement is in the official record. I want you to understand what that means." He paused. "It means that the evaluation modifications, the documentation concerns, all of it, it exists in a formal record where the course commander has acknowledged deviation from reasonable practice. That's significant protection for you going forward." "I appreciate that, sir." "Okafor and I are recommending your file be forwarded to the working group. The conversation we had Thursday about what comes after, it's not hypothetical anymore." Another pause. "I need an answer, Captain. Not today, but soon." She was standing outside the barracks in the late afternoon light, the desert going orange and pink to the west, the air cooling fast the way it always did when the sun dropped. She could see the ridgeline where position echo was, just a dark notch against the sky. "Can I ask you something, sir?" "Go ahead." "The working group, the specialized capability you described, what does it actually need from someone in my position?" "Honestly? Preferably. It needs someone who can perform at distance under conditions that exceed what doctrine currently considers achievable. It needs someone who can read environments that aren't prepared for them, without support infrastructure, in circumstances that don't have clean rules." He paused. "It also needs someone who can train others to do those things, which is a separate skill that not everyone has." She She thought about Yarbrough's wind reading above 800 yards. She thought about Decker's position break. She thought about Callaway's improving range estimation and the armory specialist who'd checked the firing pin channel when she'd modeled looking at it. The training component, she said, is that part of the initial assignment? It can be structured that way. Then I'm interested in the conversation, she said. She heard him exhale, very slightly. Good. I'll be in touch next week with specifics. Sir, one more thing. Go. Mora's notebook, the other candidates it documented. Are those records being protected? A pause. That's under review by Marsh's office. I'd appreciate being kept informed of how that resolves. Another pause. A longer one, this time with weight in it. I'll see what I can do, he said, and that was as much as she was going to get, and it was more than she'd expected. She ended the call and stood in the fading light for a while. Mora came to find her at 1900. She'd expected him at some point, had been expecting it since the armory corridor, since the conference room, since the outcome meeting where he'd sat in the back and she'd registered his presence without looking directly at him. He looked different from the man who'd confronted her 3 days ago. Not broken. She didn't think he was a man who broke cleanly, more that he eroded, wore down at the edges. The notebook was not in his hand. He stopped about 4 feet away from her, which was the distance of a man who'd decided to say something and hadn't fully decided what. The notebook is under review, he said. I know. Marsh's office is talking to the other candidates it documented. I know. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. I wasn't trying to destroy you. I want you to know that. She looked at him. She thought about what she'd said to Reeves, that people build records for different reasons, sometimes control, sometimes fear. She looked at Mora and tried to see which one he was. She thought fear, probably. The fear of a man in a position of authority, watching someone perform in ways that complicated everything he'd built his authority around. What were you trying to do? She asked. Document what I saw, he said. Which is, I know how it looks. Which isn't necessarily how it was. He blinked. No. But how it looks is part of the problem. If the documentation was legitimate, it should have been in the system. The fact that it wasn't in the system is what makes it look like something else. He absorbed that. Yeah, she looked at him. Mora, whatever the review finds, if what's in that notebook is accurate observation, say so. If some of it was colored by other things, say that too. Don't try to defend the whole thing if parts of it don't hold. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not hostility, not the defensive rebuilding, but something closer to the way people look when they're surprised to be given useful information by someone they've been treating badly. Why are you telling me that? He said. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. And because if you let them make this into something bigger than it is, it hurts the other candidates, the ones documented without cause. That shouldn't be collateral damage in your self-defense. He was quiet for a long time. I filed the complaint against you, he said. I know. That was wrong, she said. Not angry, just accurate. Yeah. He looked at the ground. Yeah, it was. She waited. I'm going to withdraw it, he said. She nodded. He started to say something else, then didn't. He nodded back at her, once, and turned and walked back toward the administration building. She watched him go. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't resolution in the clean, cinematic sense of the word, but it was something. A man choosing a harder thing over an easier one, which was more than she'd expected and more than she would have demanded. The certificates were issued Wednesday morning. 8 names on 8 documents, black ink on heavy cream paper, the course seal and the date and the qualification standard achieved. She stood in the small formation in front of the range operations building and accepted hers from Hale with both hands, which was the traditional form, and he held it for just a moment before releasing it, which wasn't traditional. And in that moment's pause, there was more said than either of them had managed in 12 weeks of circling each other. Captain Cross, he said. Sir, I hope you'll consider the instructional component that Colonel Greer mentioned. She looked at him. You know about that? Greer and I talked yesterday. He paused. I made a recommendation. Positive or negative, sir? He looked at her with something in his expression that had, in 12 weeks, traveled a significant distance. "Strongly positive," he said. She held the certificate and looked at him. "Thank you, sir," she said. He gave her a short nod, the kind that carried more than its length suggested, and moved to the next candidate. She looked at the certificate. Her name, the date, the qualification score in the lower right corner, 10 of 10, in the same plain black type as everything else, making no more visual noise than any other number, just there. A fact among facts, as permanent and unremarkable as any true thing. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket. The transport van left Black Ridge at 1300 Wednesday. Same van as arrival, same narrow seats and smeared windows, same red-brown dust coming up behind it as it rolled back through the main gate. Different 12 weeks behind them. She had a window seat. The ridgeline to the west was visible for the first few miles, and she watched it until it dropped below the horizon. Position Echo's notch, the last thing to disappear, that narrow slot in the rock where 2 rounds had changed the shape of a morning, and she understood now the shape of what came after. Calloway was 2 seats ahead. He turned around once, early on, and gave her a look that was part acknowledgement and part the particular expression of someone who has gone through something with another person and knows it's going to stay with them. She gave him a nod. He turned back around. She looked out the window at the desert moving past, the hard pan and the broken ridge lines, and the sky that was back to its ordinary Nevada blue, clean and enormous, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened under it for the last 12 weeks. She thought about Greer's call, the working group, the training component. She thought about Yarbrough's wind reading and Decker's position break, and the specialist in the armory who'd looked at the firing pin channel when she'd shown him it mattered to look. She thought about what her grandfather would say about teaching. She thought he'd say what he'd always said about it, that teaching was the same as shooting, which was the same as everything else he'd spent his life on. Preparation was the practice, and the result was what the preparation produced, and the only thing you could actually control was how seriously you took the preparation. She'd spent 12 weeks being dismissed. She'd spent 12 weeks being tested under conditions calibrated to produce failure. She'd spent 12 weeks being watched by people who had decided what she was before she'd fired a single round. And she'd come out the other side, not because she'd fought every battle, or argued every assumption, or demanded recognition at every turn. She'd come out the other side because she'd kept preparing. She'd kept reading the wind. She'd kept writing in the logbook and checking the firing pin channel and arriving an hour early and studying the grass in the depression until it told her what the flags couldn't. She'd held. When it mattered, she'd held. The van rolled north through the desert, carrying 8 people and 12 weeks of accumulated truth, and the ridgeline disappeared behind them and the road opened up ahead, and the Nevada sky went on in all directions, impossibly large, holding nothing, answering to no one. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and felt the smooth bone handle of Yarbrough's knife. She kept it there the rest of the way. The quietest victories are the ones nobody can take from you, because you earned them in the only place that matters, inside the work, before anyone was watching.